Hello, gentlemen. The theme for this video is looking at modern feminist policies and the patterns that we can see from these policies that really indicate what they're actually trying to do instead of just looking at these policies separately, which is something that I see a lot of content creators doing. Whenever people want to discuss a lot of the topics that I'm going to discuss here, they'll discuss them individually. Whereas I think it's really important to look at the pattern and look at the sort of purpose behind these policies taken together. So when evaluating policies like affirmative consent or Me Too or the idea of believing all women, I do think we can see a pattern indicating the true purpose of these policies compared to just looking at them separately. And to do this in this video, I'm going to look at the results of these policies instead of what they claim to accomplish, right? You can say that feminism is about equality, for example. We all know that's nonsense because there's no effort to actually make things equal, really, except from the standpoint of what benefits women. So this is not so much a video about why feminism's hypocritical or very few of the goals that they state or the actual goals that they have. This is going to be looking at things from the perspective of the results of these kinds of policies. And this is always the more informative way to do this analysis, I think, because as I've discussed in the past with, for example, the coronavirus stuff, and I'm not going to get into that much in this video, so don't worry, I'm not going to really talk about the coronavirus very much here, but I've mentioned in past videos when talking about topics like that you really have to look at the results of policies, not what they claim they say something is going to do. For example, you can look at small businesses not being able to meet certain standards versus the corporations which have thrived basically more than ever after the aftermath of the virus stuff, right? You can look at, oh, these vaccines are so effective versus you need your 4th and 5th boosters now. You can come up with your own conclusions. Again, I'm not going to make this video about that topic, but it's really important to look at the actual results of policies, especially when there's no attempt to change course. When you get certain results that are not consistent with what's being claimed to be the purpose of a policy, and there's no attempt to say, well, wait a second, this isn't doing what we want it to do, we need to try something else, then you can be pretty reassured that the actual results that you're seeing are the intended purpose. And so I'm going to look at the results of different feminist policies here that, when taken together, we can see the actual purpose behind these policies. And I'm going to go through a few different ones, and then I'm going to talk about what conclusions I think we can draw from that information. So with affirmative consent, right, the idea that you need to get explicit permission from someone before having sex with them. And in some cases it goes as far, some versions of this say that you need to continuously get consent throughout sexual interactions with someone in order for that to be not rape, basically. The idea of affirmative consent is absurd on its face, or pretty much on its face. It's clear to almost anyone that has any sort of familiarity with how sex happens that this is not how normal people have these interactions. This is not something that, unless you have a fetish for consent or whatnot, or the person telling you what they're going to do to you, basically, and some people do probably have a fetish for that, right? But if you're a normal person that doesn't have that sort of inclination, then you're never going to do this. This is not something that is consistent with actual human behavior when it comes to sexual interactions. And almost everybody knows this. You could not have ever had sex and you still know that that's not what people do. They don't give affirmative consent typically. That's something you discuss with someone before you get to that point where you're actually engaging with them in a sexual act, or if you're into hookup culture or you're just evaluating that, it's something that people just do, unfortunately. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but affirmative consent either way is really not in play in any realistic sense. The practical result of this policy, even though affirmative consent has been discussed as being absurd, right? There have been all kinds of people that have looked at this and said, well, affirmative consent doesn't make sense because it's not consistent with what people actually do. But the practical result, and I would argue the purpose of this policy, especially where it's been enacted on college campuses, I think that's the most common place for this to be the new sort of policy, or relatively new. The practical result is that any normal sexual activity can be labeled as rape based on not receiving this type of consent for any reason a woman chooses if she just decides to make that claim. So the idea is to just give women the ability to come back and say, I didn't get affirmative consent because nobody does that. Therefore, I didn't willingly have sex with this person, and this man, typically speaking, it's almost always going to be a guy, right, is guilty of raping me. You need to kick him off of the campus. You need to kick him out of the school, because even though it's ridiculous to expect that he's going to get that consent, and again, in some cases, the idea is to get that consent repeatedly through the act of whatever you're doing sexually, that somehow needs to be the standard so that I, as the woman, can come back later and say that I really didn't want to do this, or I don't need to take accountability for my choices. That's clearly the actual purpose of affirmative consent. And even when people have discussed that in the past on different manosphere/anti-feminist channels, I've rarely seen people just come out and just call it for what it is, right? It's not about the idea of getting consent, because no one does that. And even a lot of feminists realize that no one does that. The idea is to give women the power to come back later and retroactively say that they didn't consent to something. The idea is for them to come back later and punish the guy if she didn't get her expectations met, either with the sex or just with whatever they were doing, if they were in a relationship or dating or whatever. That's the purpose behind affirmative consent, is so that women can come back and label almost any normal sexual activity as rape if they want to do that. Let's look at a different policy, right? Let's look at Me Too. I mentioned that at the beginning of the video. Or hashtag Believe All Women, which typically goes along with Me Too. The result of these policies is that a woman can now accuse a man of sexual misconduct in the workplace with no evidence and get him fired on that basis alone, regardless of the validity of the claim that average men have power over women in this situation. In other words, average men have never had the ability to just do whatever they want to women in the workplace and not get fired for it. Maybe really powerful men that have many millions of dollars and can hire people or bribe people basically to look the other way. Maybe there's a case to be made about those men not being able to abuse really people in general, but women in the workplace, right? Even if you want to just focus on women, just for the benefit of the doubt, let's say, powerful men that actually own major companies and corporations maybe have the power to abuse women, but average men have never had the ability to just do whatever they want to a woman in a sexual way at work and not get fired for that. That's not really something that men have ever really had the ability to do. But now, after Me Too, women can make that claim anyway and then say whatever they want about a guy that they just don't like for any reason. The purpose of Me Too is to give women the power to basically get men in trouble at the workplace by saying they did something bad, especially in a sexual context, right? It's not about men really ever having power over women in that situation, especially, again, your men that are anywhere close to average. It's about the power to get a man fired if he says or does something that you don't like, or you just don't like him for some reason. And the idea is that you're just supposed to believe her, and that's literally another version of this whole phenomenon, right? That's literally another part of it. Hashtag Believe Her or Believe All Women. The idea is that you should just basically do what the woman wants, fire the guy, and move on, right? The idea is that men just need to basically suffer whenever a woman in the workplace decides that she doesn't like what a guy said or did, even if it had nothing to do with her, even if there was really nothing sexual about it, she can just make something up on the basis that he somehow has power, and you need to make sure that he doesn't abuse that power by just believing whatever accusation the woman makes. It's not about actually protecting women. It's about giving women the power to ruin a man's life, especially from the point of view of his career or his job, basically. It's the idea that a woman should have the power to be able to basically ruin his finances, to basically be able to get him fired from his job anytime she wants. That's the idea. That's the real result of Me Too and Believe All Women. Average men have never had the power to abuse women like that in the workplace. And now it's just about the idea that they have power to facilitate women getting men fired for any reason they want, right? Getting men in trouble for any reason they see fit because you're just supposed to believe her. That's the real purpose and the real result of this policy. Let's move on to something else that's even more controversial. Marital rape laws, right? Now, even in regard to these laws, we can see that the results of the policy don't correlate with the intended goal. Is it more likely that women need protection from their own bad decisions with the men that they choose to marry? Or that the accusation of marital rape will be used to initiate a divorce process that will successfully destroy the accused man if so desired? Does it really make sense that women need protection, in other words, from the choice that they make in terms of marrying someone? Like, why would you marry a guy that's going to force himself on you? Why would you do that to begin with? And yes, people can change. People can develop drug and alcohol addictions that make their personalities deteriorate, basically. But for the most part, you know whether a guy is going to be willing to do that kind of stuff. Most men have no sort of willingness to do that kind of thing to any women, let alone their own wife. So it really doesn't make sense that women need protection from their own marital choices, right? That doesn't really add up. What does make sense, and I've heard many men talk about how they had this accusation made against them, is that if a woman who plans on divorcing her husband sleeps with her husband, which is a normal thing, and then goes out and says, my husband raped me, because these spousal rape laws allow her to do that, then you're in a situation where he can't really prove that it didn't happen because they did indeed have sex, and she can just say, well, he used his power in the marriage against me, or he used the fact that he was my husband and that we were still together to have his way with me and get what he wanted sexually, right? That I've heard talked about many, many times where guys have been on the receiving end of that. Whereas again, when it comes to actually being protected from men doing those things, it doesn't really add up. Why would you marry a guy like that in the first place? Why would you put yourself in that situation? Why wouldn't you just divorce him before he had the opportunity to even do something like that if you didn't like something about his personality or behavior? It doesn't really make sense, let alone discussing the idea that women should be accountable for their own choices. It doesn't even go that far, right? It's more about, why does that make any sense that you get married? Like, why would you do that to yourself as a woman with a guy that was that way? Does that make sense compared to just being able to use that as a tool to destroy a man's life, to make this accusation and potentially get him in prison because he can't prove that it was consensual? Maybe he's able to not go to prison, but that's going to be used at the very least in the family law courts to absolutely destroy him, because you don't need the preponderance of evidence anymore. You don't need the facts to really even be on your side. All you have to do is say, yeah, he did these bad things to me even though we were married. So in conclusion, with the policies that I've looked at here, and I'm sure that you guys can come up with some other similar policies or similar things that are going on, the goal of these policies is to allow women to establish total control over their everyday interactions with men in the workplace, when it comes to Me Too, in universities and school, when it comes to things like affirmative consent, and when it comes to the spousal rape laws, when it comes to sex and marriage. All of this is about controlling men completely, controlling men in relationships, controlling men at school, controlling men at work. That is the common theme with all of these policies, and I rarely see this talked about within the men's community or the anti-feminist community. These things are discussed individually and separately, but the theme is actually pretty clear. Affirmative consent is ridiculous. It makes no sense to think that that's what people are actually going to do. Even feminists that support this policy know darn well that it doesn't really happen. The purpose is control of men through these sexual interactions. Same thing with Me Too. If you date a woman that you work with, you are putting yourself in a position for an accusation to be made against you that's going to get you fired, even if it's completely baseless. The purpose of Me Too is for women to be able to control men at work, especially the men that actually like them, are foolish enough in today's environment to date them, or maybe they don't have anything to do with them and the women just, they don't like them, so they just make up something, right? And again, when it comes to marriage, what's the point of getting married today if you're a guy if the woman can just say that you did these bad things to her anyway because you had sex, and now it's a he said versus she said thing? That is the real purpose of all of these policies, guys. And so the idea, again, is to control everyday interactions with men, primarily through men's desire for sex and companionship, so that women can maintain all of their standard expectations of men while also having the power to turn those interactions against those men should they not get what they want or change their minds about their original intentions. It gives women complete control over men in these contexts. That's the purpose of all of these policies, guys. They're basically all the same. They just apply to different environments. In all of these cases, the appropriate reaction for men is to stop associating with women in these contexts, in the specific terms that apply, and refuse to put themselves in a losing situation. That is the proper response. The solution is to refuse to play these sorts of games and maintain personal autonomy by rejecting these terms of engagement. So what do I mean by that? Affirmative consent. What's the specific context? Having sex with women in an environment where affirmative consent is the policy, particularly on certain college campuses. That's where you see it most often, although you can expect that this could spread to other environments as well in the future. Okay, so what's the solution to that? Don't have sex with women at school. Don't have sexual interactions with women that you go to school with. If you're going to date or have sex with a particular woman, you find someone off campus that doesn't go to your school. That's the clear solution to this, right? I'm not going to advocate for whether men should be monk mode or whatever. That's not the purpose of this video. The point is, if you're going to do that, adapt. Don't have sex with women on campus. Don't have sex with women that you go to school with, regardless of whether it's on campus. That way the school has no jurisdiction over you. If this applies to a different environment in the future, if it's some other institution tries to use affirmative consent as their main way of determining sexual discourse, if you want to call it that, then just don't have sex with women in those environments. That's the way to compensate for this so that women don't get that control over you. How does this apply to Me Too? Don't date women that you work with. Don't even be alone with women that you work with. Don't mentor her. Don't be a part of a situation at all with women that you work with. Don't really even be their friends outside of work. Only deal with them in terms of what you have to do to make money, in terms of your job. Outside of that, I mean, I'm not saying you can never talk to them, but don't be alone with them and don't really be friends with them outside of work. It sucks that that's where we're at, but that's the clear and very straightforward solution to this, guys. Just don't do it, right? That's the response to Me Too. Women want to have control over men that they work with. You refuse to give them a whole lot of control, right? I mean, they could still put you in a negative situation potentially, but you don't date them. You don't spend time with them outside of work. You're not alone with them, and you don't really help them besides doing your job. That's the solution to that. What's the solution to something like marital struggle snuggle laws? What's the solution to that? Don't get married. That's just another reason for men not to get married. Women don't do anything else in relationships today in modern Western society anyway, right? They don't have any other sort of gendered expectations that they're supposed to meet, and they're not obligated to sleep with you. And so again, most guys are never going to want to do that to the woman that they're in a relationship with anyhow. So the solution is, a woman can't claim that you did these bad things to her in a marriage if you're never going to get married. And then it becomes more of a thing of, if she's just your girlfriend and she accuses you of something, or if you're just part of hookup culture, which again, I really don't support, but she can stop doing that. She's not your wife. she can just break up with you and leave. And now she has a harder time explaining why she chose to keep sleeping with you if she could get out of that relationship just based on a whim or just based on deciding that she didn't want to be in a relationship with you anymore. But with marriage, it's like she can make this claim that, oh, he had power over me. Well, that doesn't exist if you don't get married. That's the solution to this, guys. And so the conclusion for this video is that as long as these sort of policies continue to receive support, the idea of controlling men, particularly through their sexuality, by punishing men for not doing what women want. If he doesn't call me back the next day and we go to a school where affirmative consent is the policy, I'm going to say that I didn't consent to it. Well, you can't do that if you're not hooking up with someone that you go to school with. And as long as these kinds of policies continue to receive support, they continue to be the policy basically, and have a potential negative impact on you as men or you as a man, women can ultimately deal with the consequences of these policies while men focus on making better choices for themselves. Men just say, you know what? There's a very simple solution to this. It may not be the optimal solution. It may not be what we wanted, right? Most men would prefer to have healthy connections with the women that they like or the women that they would otherwise potentially date or whatever the case may be, but we're going to adapt to that. We're not going to deal with you with affirmative consent. No one does this. Almost anyone that has any sort of knowledge whatsoever about what sex is between two humans knows that affirmative consent doesn't happen. We know that it's about control. So we're just not going to allow ourselves to be controlled by this. If you're going to have sex with someone or have a girlfriend or whatever the case may be, whatever the form of interaction that takes, do it with a girl that doesn't go to your school and that is not on campus. Go to her place or whatever the case may be. Don't do that when affirmative consent is the rule, right? If you can't get away from it, then just don't sleep with the women around you. That's the solution. And then women are going to complain, oh, men don't approach us. Where are all the men? That's their problem. Same with me too. Oh, they won't mentor her because they're afraid to be with us. Sir, you're not a real man because you're afraid to be with a woman. Who cares? That's your problem. Same thing with the idea of marital rape, right? The idea that, oh, well, you just need to get married now. There's no benefits for men in marriage anymore anyway. So this is just one more reason not to get married. And who's going to lose out, right? I've discussed this at length in the past. The long-term consequences of feminism are more beneficial to men than they are to women. And I'm far from the first one in the men's community to say that. The long-term consequences of these policies are going to hurt women because guys that are smart enough to figure out what I've been talking about here, they're just not going to get married and put themselves in a situation where there can be marital rape. They're just not going to do those kinds of things, do sexual things with women on college campuses. They're not going to approach you. They're not going to spend time with you. Why? Because they know that affirmative consent is absurd and they're just not going to put themselves in that situation in areas where that's the policy. Again, with Me Too, just don't mess with women that you work with. Don't be alone with them. Don't date them, that's for sure. Don't sleep with them. Don't flirt with them. Don't do any of those things. And if women don't like that, whose problem does that become now? That becomes women's problem because they supported these policies along with men that were foolish enough and thinking with their dicks that decided that they wanted affirmative consent as well. But for the guys that are smart enough to figure this out and have self-respect and care about their future, they're just not going to be a part of this. And that is the solution. The solution is to stop engaging with women in these contexts and just not allow women to have that kind of power over you. And if women want to change things to make them more reasonable, they can. It's probably not going to happen, but that's up to them. It becomes women's problem now. And that's the sort of good thing about this for guys, is that women can complain about, oh, look at what feminism's done, and whether they actually come out as anti-feminist or not is kind of irrelevant. They can say, oh, well, now men won't do this and do that. That's right. We won't. We're not going to be part of a situation that is made to control us. We're not going to allow that to happen. Because if you're going to have these policies, we're just going to walk away from that. That's the solution. And so I wanted to talk about this from the standpoint of looking at all these kinds of policies together and what the real sort of main theme is, in my opinion, of these policies. It's not about protecting women. It's not about equality. It's not about any of the things that feminists say that these policies are about. It's about controlling men at work, controlling men at school, controlling men in the home. That's what all of these policies are really about, because they don't make sense on their face. Affirmative consent's the easiest one to pick on. Me Too is fairly easy to pick on as well. Most people, unfortunately, are not, I think, really aware that spousal rape doesn't make sense. Why would you marry that person in the first place? Versus all the times that this is used against men based on a claim that, well, you had sex with me even though I was your wife, I didn't consent to it. I've heard so many men talk about how they were on the really negative end of that. That's the real purpose of the policy. The real purpose is control. Don't allow yourself to be controlled in those ways, and it doesn't become a problem. It becomes a problem for women because now they're not going to have men interested in them in those contexts, right? Women that go to college are going to have the men that are smart enough to see what's going on basically avoid them. Same thing with the workplace, with Me Too. Why date a woman that can just get you fired based on an accusation instead of just staying away from women? And girls will blame men in a lot of cases, but again, that's kind of too bad. Same with marriage. This is just another reason not to get married. So that's the sort of conclusion, guys. Look at these policies kind of together and see the common thread. See the real purpose of what they're trying to do. Don't get too caught up in the individual policies and the individual sort of issues, because you can talk about how dumb something like affirmative consent is all day, but when you understand its real purpose, it does make sense, right? Because now women can come back and say, well, you didn't get this affirmative consent, so I'm saying you did these bad things to me now. That's the real purpose behind these policies. And the thing to do is to basically stay away from it and let women deal with the aftermath of men not allowing themselves to be part of those situations.